welcome to another of Lawrence Van Hook Chapter's American Revolution retrospective programs. I'm Amy Sunleaf, Chapter Regent. Grant Wood and George Washington have a lot of commonalities. For one thing, they both have the same initials. For another, they both lost their fathers at young ages. Grant Wood was 10 when his father died at age 46, and George Washington was 11 years old when his father died at age 48. They both had very influential mothers and were sensitive men. Neither had any biological children to carry on their legacy. Both served in the military and had insecurities about their lack of formal education, as neither attended college. They both also have February birthdays. George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732, and Grant Wood, February 13th, 1891. Finally, they were both very patriotic men who truly loved America. I hope you enjoy learning more about their unique connections. Now, looking at this first slide, how apropos that Grant Wood seems to be staring right at young George in this picture. We're going to learn more about that painting in a few moments. But first, let's learn about the Veterans Memorial window. When he was still a relatively unknown artist, Grant Wood applied to design a stained glass window at the new Veterans Memorial Building in Cedar Rapids. The project began in 1927 and took 2 years to complete. Here he is at the Quaker Oats Recreation Building in downtown Cedar Rapids, the only place tall enough for him to work on his 20 by 24-foot paper version of his design. These were the stained glass projects that Grant Wood had worked on before he applied to make that window. The slag glass lampshade and the window in the Turner Mortuary are quite a contrast to his memorial window. At 20 by 24 feet, you have to see this window in person to get a sense of its scale. It contains 57 window panels and over 9,000 pieces of glass. The Emil Frey Art Glass Company of St. Louis, Missouri, was awarded the bid to fabricate the glass for the window. However, it was found that due to the intricate detail aspired for the piece, it was necessary for the glass to be manufactured at their factory in Munich, Germany. The ever meticulous Wood traveled to Munich to supervise the final stages of the production of the delicate pieces of mouth-blown glass. He took advantage of these months abroad and visited museums and became intrigued by late Gothic and Northern Renaissance style paintings. He became inspired by what he called storytelling pictures, particularly the works of Hans Memling and other Northern Renaissance artists. This prompted him to reevaluate continuing to paint in the Impressionist style. And this trip gave Wood an eye for a different kind of detail and the use of things and people he knew well to tell the stories in his works. From this point onward, you can see a marked change in his painting style that celebrates such themes. This practice became Grant Wood's trademark. Nan Wood's scrapbooks and Grant Wood's sketchbooks are owned by the Figge Art Museum in Davenport, Iowa. They have been digitized by the University of Iowa and are available to view online. Note the handwriting in red at the bottom of the newspaper page. At one time, the stained glass window was the largest not only in the United States, but in the world. On the left is one of Grant Wood's preliminary sketches. Notice how closely it resembles the finished product. On the right are members and seniors of the Iowa Society Children of the American Revolution at their 2022 state meeting. You can really get a sense of the enormity of the work when you see people standing in front of it. Let's look at some of the details of that beautiful window. The base is flanked by 2 sets of soldiers in private uniforms. Starting at the left is an Army private from the Revolutionary War, then the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the First World War. Now, Wood specifically made the models privates as he believed that is where the bulk of action happened, and he knew that privates were very rarely recognized or rewarded for their service. In fact, he served as a private in World War I. As to that bare-chested 1812 naval cannoneer, one historian who works at the Veterans Center wonders if it was one of Jean Lafitte's men. Jean Lafitte was a French pirate and privateer, and he operated in the Gulf of Mexico in the early 19th century and joined forces with Andrew Jackson to protect New Orleans. The cannoneer holds a ramrod in his right hand, and he's barefoot, probably because on those slippery ships, bare feet had a better grip. And he's bare chested because the sparks and flames could light a cannonier's clothing on fire. Now look at the lower left photo. Notice the wet and muddy floor? These were the receded floodwaters of 2008. Now look down the hallway and you'll see a room with the double doors. That's a museum. And in that museum, you can see the original drawings called cartoons of the windows. These drawings were feared lost for many years. One day, a janitor saw some rolled up paper in the basement tucked into the ductwork. Upon retrieving them, he knew he'd found a treasure. The cartoons were restored and they are now archivally mounted and on display. Here's a picture of Grant Wood with some of the Emil Frey Company's German artisans, and note that the window is in the background. Guess who Grant Wood talked into serving as his model for the Lady of Peace? And if you guessed his sister Nan, you are correct. In 1930, she posed for American Gothic. Now, this depiction roused particular hostility. That woman's face would positively sour milk, wrote one farmer's wife. Grant was afraid such comments hurt Nan, who was quickly recognized as the model. The portrait of Nan was painted in 1931 in the colonial style of early America. It was the only painting he refused to sell, and he designed his entire Iowa City living room around it, which you can see in that lower picture. Now, back to the picture of Nan. Note the chick in her hand. You'll see that again later. There's a lot of meaningful artwork symbolism in this window, and like I said, Grant Wood was a veteran himself, so he knew just how veterans would feel when they saw this window. So if you start at the bottom of the arch and go up to the middle or the keystone, that is the insignia of the United States Navy. And then from the middle to the Red Cross going to the right is the insignia of the US Army. And from the Red Cross down is the insignia of the United States Marines. The large figure in the middle, the female, is Lady of Peace, also known as Republic, or America herself. The lady is robed with a blue mourning veil draped over her head, and her floating body is surrounded by clouds. In her right hand, she holds the palm branch of peace, and in her left, the laurel wreath of victory. The memorial window was nearly lost in the 2008 flood. Remember, you saw that in a couple of pictures before this one. And even though the river didn't actually reach the stained glass, uncontrolled atmospheric changes indoors and out sent more than 100 cracks rippling through the window in the months following the flood. A company in Davenport, Iowa, expertly restored the window, and it has protective exterior frames now that will ensure that it lasts another 100 years. In fact, it did survive that 2020 derecho unscathed, as you could see from that 2022 window when the Iowa CAR was standing in front of it. Now, this window, while beautiful, was not without controversy. The DAR and American Legion felt that Grant Wood should have used American artisans, as anti German sentiment was still high in 1929. However, if he had not traveled to Germany, would that regionalism style have evolved? And would any of the works that we're going to see in the following slides have ever been painted? You be the judge. Overmantel decoration, 1930. This was painted for the wealthy Cedar Rapids Stamets family. Grant used regionalism techniques as well as those used by Currier and Ives in their lithographs. Now, note the similarities between the Stamets house on the left and that Currier and Ives house on the right. Do you recognize that house? It's George Washington's Mount Vernon. We're going to move on to a next painting, which was done in 1931, and it's The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Grant Wood loved painting American rural life as he thought that's where real patriotism was found. He endeavored to immortalize scenes of American life and was very interested in highlighting the stories he'd enjoyed as a youth. One of these stories was Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This was an 1863 poem. And you've probably all heard it. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. In the 1930s, as Grant Wood became more widely known, he expanded from painting places and characters from his childhood to more historical themes. During the Great Depression, Grant Wood's intention was to remind people of the historic times of the past and of the greatness of the United States. Now, his work had critics who said that his childlike depiction made fun of this American legend. If you'd like to see this painting in person, go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and let's look at some of the details. And you be the judge if you think it was a good representation of that legend. First, does it look like midnight to you? Now, the sky is an inky black, but there looks like there's a spotlight shining down from above on the scene. Grant Wood loved the theater, and he did a lot of set making and design that you can see come through in his paintings. Look at those windows and the doors and the lighting. It looks like electricity more than candles or lanterns. Another criticism that Grant Wood had about his painting was that the landscape is more Jones County, Iowa than Boston, Massachusetts. Also, look at the paved road. In the 18th century, the roads would have been dirt paths or wagon trails. And in Grant's painting, it looks like a white ribbon rolling through the countryside. Also, why is there no light in the steeple? Now look up into the upper right corner. Is that another town? Is that Lexington and this is Concord? Or do you think the British are coming? One last criticism deals with the horse and the fact that it has all 4 feet off the ground at the same time, which is an impossible feat unless the horse is jumping. When you learn that Grant Wood used a child's rocking horse as a model for Revere's horse, it makes much more sense. Grant Wood took metalworking classes in Minneapolis and Chicago. In 1914, he and Christopher Haga, a Norwegian silversmith, formed the Volan Craft Shops in Park Ridge, Illinois. This enterprise lasted only 18 months due to insufficient funds, but the shops produced small gold and silver items such as jewelry, boxes, and buckles. The teapot was among the most ambitious products they ever made. And if you haven't already guessed, the left is Paul Revere's and the right is Grant Wood's. Our next painting is Daughters of Revolution, which was painted in 1932. And this has a tie back to that stained glass window that we learned about and that was completed in 1929. That was never dedicated due to those concerns from the local Daughters of the American Revolution and the American Legion about it being manufactured in Germany. And that hurt Grant Woods because, like I had told you already, he was a veteran and he poured his heart and soul into that window and he knew that it was $1 million window. Now, take a look at the date of this painting. Do you notice significance? 1932 was the bicentennial of George Washington's birth. 1932 will be much like 2026's semi-quincentennial of our nation will be. Dedications and activities were everywhere. Grant Wood was angry when he saw the Cedar Rapids DAR plant a bicentennial tree and dedicate it with a DAR marker right across from the Veterans Memorial Building. His resentment got the better of him, and he began sketching. This was the result. In the 1950s, Coe College acquired the charcoal sketch for their collections, and today it's on display in their library. Now, Grant Wood publicly called this painting a satire. In her new book, Barbara Feller writes, quote, "Of all the teacups raised, I believe it is safe to say that none received more attention or comment than the simple blue willow cup held by the hand of Fran Prescott in Grant Wood's painting," end quote. Prescott was the Cedar Rapids principal who had hired Woods as an art teacher and said she'd be happy to lend a hand if he ever needed it. And he literally took her up on her offer. Now, this painting debuted in Cedar Rapids, and then it was shipped to Chicago for the art exhibit at the 1932 World's Fair. But in between that time, there were a lot of letters to the editor, some from the DAR members, about how they thought that painting should not be on display. News of that controversy between Grant and the DAR spread, and people flocked to the fair to see it in person. Its reproduction postcards outsold all of the other works of art on display. Now, if you'd like to see it in person, travel to the Cincinnati Art Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio, where it's still one of the most widely viewed pieces of art in their collection. Now, Wood intended to show the hypocrisy of people and their false appearances. So let's take a closer look at what this means. First, though, I think that Adolescents and Daughters of Revolution are nice companion pieces. And Grant Wood did sketch out the idea for adolescence long before he painted it in 1933. So, why are they good companion pieces? Well, each painting has three main characters in the forefront. Also, look at the middle woman's bony hand. Doesn't it resemble a chicken's foot? And notice how Wood painted the ladies: tightened lips, beaky noses, thick, elongated necks. Another name for puffed up hens is old biddies. Do you think Grant Wood was calling the DAR a bunch of meddlesome old biddies? Blue Willow China was an English brand which produced designs reminiscent of the Far East, neither of which is American. Remember the hypocrisy that he's trying to point out. And what do you think was in that tea cup? And also note the company. Could Wood have added yet another dig to the ladies of the DAR with this detail? Now look at the pearl earrings on the woman on the left. Pearls come from the Far East. And how about that lace collar, possibly from Belgium, and the brooch from Germany? Now we know that the lace and the brooch were gifts that Wood actually did buy for his mother while he was working on the stained glass in Germany. Another dig. How about that faded picture in the background? Does that look familiar? Washington crossing the Delaware is, of course, very famous, and Grant Wood knew that Emanuel Lutze was a German born painter who had painted this work in Dusseldorf, Germany, using German models and the Rhine as a stand in for the Delaware River. And he also probably knew that in 1931, as the buildup to the bicentennial celebration of George Washington's birth was in full swing, the New York DAR discovered the painting of their much revered Washington rolled up and in storage at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. They were indignant and insisted the artwork be displayed prominently, or said it should be removed and placed somewhere where it would be on display at all times. It has also been suggested that Wood was giving a nod to some of the founding fathers in his painting. Now, overall, this painting is a lot of fun, and through the years, the DAR have come to enjoy it and even embrace it. Parson Weems' Fable was first painted in 1939, and this was our cover photo that I said it looked like he was looking at George, and we're going to learn more about that now. Now, this painting coincided with the sesquicentennial, or the 150th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration, and it was unveiled at the 1939 New York World's Fair. This painting has also been referenced as maybe one of the last great paintings done by Grant Wood. If you would like to see it in person, go to the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, Texas. So, who was Parson Weems? Parson Locke Weems, more commonly known as Parson Weems, was an American author who wrote several biographies of historical figures, the most famous of which was his 1800 biography of George Washington. Written a year after Washington's death, Weems's biography served as the point of origin for many long-held myths about Washington, and in particular, the famous cherry tree story. Remember, I told you how patriotic Grant Wood was, and here's what he had to say about this painting. When I was a boy, we all learned the story of George Washington and the cherry tree and accepted it as gospel truth. The present, more enlightened younger generation, however, is well aware that this incident never happened, but that it was the invention of Washington's most famous biographer, the Reverend Mason Locke Weems. The conviction that a valuable and colorful part of our national heritage is being lost as a result of the work of analytical historians and debunking biographers prompted me to paint my version of George Washington and the cherry tree. I sincerely hope that this painting will reawaken interest in the cherry tree and other bits of American folklore that are too good to lose. Let's look at some of the fun details of this painting, and there are many. So Wood painted this picture in the style of Charles Wilson Peale's The Artist in His Museum. Now, Charles Wilson Peale was an artist who had painted many, many Revolutionary War figures. And in this, he's painting himself, revealing a museum behind him. Now, that museum was oddities and other collections that Charles Wilson Peale had collected himself, and they were on display in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And note that Parson Weems is pulling back the curtain on Grant Wood's picture. Wood again playfully presents this story, much like the Ride of Paul Revere, in the manner of a costume stage play rather than a real event. Note the spotlight, and of course, the red velvet curtains common to theaters. Now, take a close look at the fringe on those curtains. They're cherries. One of the first things most people notice about this painting is the absurd adult head atop a child's body. The wispy white wave of his hair and the iconic profile instantly mark him as George Washington. Young George has Old George's face, and by Old George, it's the face on Gilbert Stuart's famous portrait. In 1932, this portrait was placed in every classroom in the nation in celebration of George's 200th birthday, so everyone at that time was very familiar with it. Even today, it's familiar as it's the same portrait on the $1 bill. Now, note that in 1932 or 1933, his portrait faced to the left, and today it faces to the right, but it's still George Washington. Now, nearly all of the lines in this painting are pointing toward one person, and that's little George and his axe. Note that the hand and fingers of the trio in the foreground are all pointing at that axe, as is the edge of the house, the ladder, and even the sliver of tree bark. This immediately draws our attention to that spot. Now, amid all that action in the front of the picture, there are two black figures picking cherries in the background, and this may have been a reference to Washington's slaveholding past and a reminder of what often gets left out in historical myth making. This is the only painting by Wood to include Black Americans. Grant Wood's home on East Court Street in Iowa City served as a stand in for George Washington's boyhood home, Ferry Farm. Another example of Grant Wood painting what he knew best. Now, Ferry Farm is where young George Washington spent his formative years. This replica of George Washington's childhood home was completed in 2018, and it was built on the foundations of the original home, which were excavated during archaeological investigations that began in 2002. So maybe that's why Wood used his own house. Ferry Farm hadn't been excavated or rebuilt in the 1930s. Wood's final American Revolution theme work is one you've probably never heard of. If you'd like to see it in person, go to the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College. Now, this is the 1940 portrait of Oliver Wiswell, and it was cover art for a novel, Oliver Wiswell, by Kenneth Roberts. And the background of this novel of the American Revolution is Boston, New York, Paris, Kentucky, and South Carolina. The story is told by Oliver Wiswell, who was a New Englander loyal to England. Let's talk some more about that feud between Grant Wood and the DAR. Part of the reason that this window is not better known is that there was not a lot of worldwide acclaim for it due to the lack of a dedication ceremony. The window was finally dedicated in 1955, 13 years after Wood's death. Between the time the window was completed and the dedication, two more wars had been fought. In 2010, after the window was fixed, cleaned, and reinstalled, it was rededicated. But neither the 1955 nor the 2010 dedication was conducted by the DAR. Now, Grant Wood never intended the DAR to dedicate his window, but the the DAR chapter that caused all the ruckus is the Ashley chapter of Cedar Rapids. Now, last year in 2024, they rededicated this really lovely water fountain. And the very ironic thing about that Grant Wood would have loved is that this water fountain is mere steps away from 5 Turner Alley. Now, 5 Turner Alley is where Grant Wood painted American Gothic, Portrait of Nan, Daughters of Revolution, and The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. As I was going through those scrapbooks, I found this page. It's got an application for the Daughters of the American Revolution. Grant Wood's Aunt Sally was a DAR member of Anna Mose's Francis Shaw chapter, and she wanted Nan to join. Now, the Wood family is buried in Riverside Cemetery in Anamosa, and it's the final resting place of Grant Wood and many of his family members. Now, Wood's actual tombstone is very modest and unremarkable, but the Wood family has this lovely sleeping lion monument. In May 2021, Iowa daughters from 3 Eastern Iowa chapters met at Anamosa's Riverside Cemetery to properly clean the Wood family's lion monument. On the right is a picture from fall 2024, so you can see it still looks great. Today, the DAR really loved Daughters of Revolution. In 2022, former President General Denise Doreen Van Buren posted on Facebook showing off the print she'd bought at a fundraising auction in Nevada. She tells the story about both the window and the revenge painting in her post. Now, back to that DAR connection. As I was looking through Sally or Sarah Wood's information, I found that their patriot was Levi Hollingsworth, and Levi Hollingsworth was a quartermaster for the 1st Troop in Philadelphia. And then I found out that the 1st Troop were bodyguards to General George Washington. So, what a way to close that circle and come just to a great ending. And in closing, here's a glimpse of the Jones County Freedom Rock. Now, note which veteran Bubba Sorensen included on the front of the rock. Again, Grant Wood's job during World War I was designing uniforms, painting camouflage scenes, and camouflaging equipment, and he was a proud veteran. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution and the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, let's salute Grant Wood and his dedication to patriotism and keeping the stories from our past alive. And let's also remember not to take ourselves too seriously. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed learning more about this wonderful Iowa son and his connection to General George Washington.